All right, so you're back with us for another deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be looking into the IEA's Global Energy Review for 2025.
IEA.
Yeah, so it can be a little bit dense,
Yeah,
but we're going to break down some of the really important trends and insights, I think, for you.
absolutely.
We'll talk about everything from oil and gas to solar and wind and what it all means for CO2 emissions.
Exactly. And I think what makes this deep dive so fascinating is that the IEA really is the authority on all things energy.
Yeah, they're the gold standard.
Yeah, they really are. Their mission, is ensuring reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy.
Mm-hmm.
And their reach is huge. They cover 32 member countries,
Okay.
including big players like the United States, the UK, Germany, Japan, and 13 association countries like China and India and Brazil.
Wow.
So their analysis carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, that's really helpful for us, too.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack what this latest review tells us. Our goal today is to figure out, what are the major shifts that happened in energy demand and supply in 2024?
Yeah.
What impact did different fuels and technologies have, and what's the overall picture for carbon emissions?
Okay.
And we're going to try and do this without boring you to death with a bunch of numbers and charts and graphs and stuff. So hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll walk away with a solid understanding of the big picture of what happened.
Absolutely.
So first off, let's talk about global energy demand in 2024. It sounds like we used a lot more energy last year.
Yeah, we did. Global energy demand actually grew by a pretty substantial 2.2%.
Okay.
In 2024.
So is that a lot?
That is a lot if you consider, the last decade.
Yeah.
The average growth was about 1.3%.
Okay.
So this is a big acceleration.
Okay.
And what's even more interesting is that electricity demand surged even faster by about 4.3%. And that's almost double the overall energy demand growth, and it outpaced global GDP growth, which was only 3.2%.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this huge jump in electricity demand, almost double the overall energy growth, I think shows that we're electrifying the world.
Yeah.
More and more, not just with electric vehicles, but with data centers and AI, all these things need a lot of power.
It's the unseen energy use, right? That we often forget about.
Yeah, it's behind the scenes, but it's growing really fast.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so electricity demand really shot up, but what exactly was driving that?
I mean, several things really came together.
Okay.
We had record high temperatures in lots of parts of the world, which obviously increased the need for cooling.
Air conditioning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Industrial activity also picked up in certain regions.
All right.
And of course, electric vehicles continue to become more popular.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, the expansion of data centers and artificial intelligence, all that computing takes a ton of energy.
It's like a whole hidden world of energy consumption that most people don't even think about.
Exactly. It's huge, and it's only getting bigger.
Yeah. Wow. So geographically, where did we see most of this increase in energy demand?
Well, emerging and developing economies, they were responsible for over 80% of the increase.
Oh, wow.
In energy demand.
Okay.
China, had the largest increase overall.
Okay.
But India's growth was also really substantial. In fact, it was bigger than all the advanced economies put together.
Okay.
So that's a pretty significant shift in the global energy landscape.
Wow. So the more developed countries are not the ones driving this huge increase?
Not in terms of growth rate, no.
Okay.
But it's important to point out that the advanced economies did see a return to growth in energy demand, almost 1% overall.
Okay.
The U.S. was the third largest contributor to absolute growth.
Okay.
And the EU actually saw its energy demand grow for the first time since 2017.
Oh, wow.
If you don't count the rebound after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
Yeah, so we saw growth pretty much everywhere.
Okay.
But developing countries were definitely leading the way.
Wow. Interesting. So with this huge surge in energy demand, where did all this energy come from?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, what were the main sources meeting this increased appetite?
Well, renewables definitely took the lead.
Okay.
They were responsible for 38% of the growth in energy supply.
So they're the biggest source of growth.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Natural gas was next at 28%, followed by coal at 15%, oil at 11%, and nuclear at 8%.
Okay.
So you can really see the shift that's happening.
That's a real mix, right?
It is.
It's not just one thing.
Definitely a mix, but it's interesting to see how the proportions are changing.
Right, yeah. Okay, so you mentioned oil. How did oil do in this evolving energy landscape?
Yeah, well, oil demand growth actually slowed down quite a bit in 2024.
Really?
It only increased by 0.8% compared to 1.9% the year before.
Okay.
But what's really striking is that oil's share of total energy demand fell below 30%
Really?
for the first time in 50 years.
That's a huge shift.
It is. I mean, think about it. Back in 1973, it peaked at 46%.
Wow. Yeah.
So the fact that oil's share of the energy pie dipped below 30% for the first time in 5 decades, that's not just a statistic. You know?
Yeah.
This could be a sign of a much bigger shift away from oil as cleaner energy sources gain traction.
Yeah.
While there's still growth in certain sectors like aviation and petrochemicals, this milestone, I think, really highlights the challenges that the oil industry is facing in a world that's moving towards decarbonization.
Yeah, it's definitely a sign of the times, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what caused this slowdown in oil demand, this shrinking market share?
Well, a few things were happening.
Okay.
Growth in road transport demand moderated.
Okay.
It even declined slightly in some regions, probably because of electric vehicles and high-speed rail networks, especially in China.
Yeah.
But we did see some growth in oil demand from the aviation and petrochemical sectors.
Okay.
And there was also a modest increase in the demand for liquid biofuels, with Brazil and the U.S. leading the way there.
Okay, so it sounds like there are still pockets of growth for oil in certain sectors, but the overall trend is one of slowing growth.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's move on to natural gas.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it was the second biggest source of supply growth.
Yeah. Natural gas had the strongest growth among fossil fuels.
Okay.
Demand increased by 2.7%.
Wow.
China was the biggest contributor to this growth in absolute terms, with an increase of over 7%.
Yeah.
We also saw really strong growth in other Asian developing economies and in the U.S.
Yeah.
The EU saw a more modest growth, mostly in industrial use.
Okay.
The growth was mainly driven by the industrial and power sectors.
Okay.
Extreme weather, like heat waves, also played a part in boosting demand for gas-fired power generation.
Oh, yeah, because they had to use the power plants more, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And we also saw a trend of gas replacing oil in some areas.
Interesting.
Yeah, so while oil growth was slowing down, natural gas was seeing an increase in demand in certain sectors.
Okay, so a mixed picture for fossil fuels. Oil slowing down, gas going up. What about coal? Is it still a major player?
Yeah, coal is still a significant part of the global energy mix, but its growth also slowed down in 2024.
Okay.
Increasing by only about 1%.
Okay.
Most of this growth was for power generation.
Okay.
Mostly because of the high cooling demand we talked about earlier.
Right, yeah.
China and India were responsible for almost all of this global increase.
Wow.
China, in particular, is still the world's largest coal consumer by far.
Right.
They account for 58% of global coal use.
Wow.
But coal demand did continue to fall in advanced economies.
Okay.
And it's really important to note that without the growth of renewables and nuclear power, the increase in coal demand would have been a lot bigger.
Yeah, it seems like renewables and nuclear are really playing a crucial role in keeping our reliance on coal in check.
Exactly. They're making a big difference.
Okay, so it's got this complex picture for fossil fuels. Oil's growth is slowing, gas is on the rise, and coal is still a factor, but renewables and nuclear are helping to limit its growth. But let's shift gears now and talk about electricity generation.
Okay.
We heard about the record increase in electricity consumption. How was all that electricity produced?
Well, global electricity consumption had a huge jump, nearly 1,100 terawatt hours.
1,100 terawatt hours.
Yeah, and that's a massive amount of energy. I mean, it's enough to power hundreds of millions of homes for a whole year.
Wow, that's mind-boggling.
It is, and to put it into perspective, this increase alone is bigger than Japan's entire annual electricity consumption.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a massive increase, and it happened pretty much across the board.
Wow.
I mean, again, it was driven by a few key factors. Those record high temperatures meant more people needed air conditioning.
Yeah.
Industrial activity was up, more electric vehicles were on the road, and the expansion of data centers was a big factor too.
Okay.
Globally, the installed capacity of data centers grew by an estimated 15 gigawatts.
Wow.
And most of that growth was in the U.S. and China.
So all these data centers are using a ton of electricity.
Yeah, huge amounts.
Okay, so how did we generate all this extra electricity?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
80% of the growth in global electricity generation came from renewables and nuclear power.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and for the first time, these low-emission sources together provided 40% of total electricity generation.
40%? That's incredible.
It's a major milestone in the transition to cleaner energy.
Yeah, so renewables alone accounted for 32% of global electricity generation.
That's right.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah, it really shows how renewables are becoming mainstream.
Okay, so what kind of growth did renewables see in 2024?
Well, we saw a record level of new renewable installations.
Okay.
For the 22nd year in a row.
Wow.
About 700 gigawatts of total renewable capacity was added in 2024.
700 gigawatts.
Yeah.
Okay.
And solar PV was the dominant technology,
Right.
making up almost 80% of that new capacity.
Wow.
And generation from solar and wind combined increased by a record 670 terawatt hours.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it was a big year for solar and wind. In fact, in the EU, solar and wind together generated more electricity than coal and gas combined.
Really?
And in the U.S., they even overtook coal.
Wow.
And in China, they reached nearly 20% of total electricity generation.
Wow. That's amazing progress.
Yeah, it really shows how these technologies are taking off.
Yeah, so solar and wind are clearly on the rise.
What about nuclear power? You mentioned that it also contributed to the growth in electricity generation.
Yeah, nuclear power had a good year too.
Okay.
Capacity additions increased significantly in 2024, 33% more than in 2023.
Wow.
The amount of nuclear capacity added was the 5th highest in the last 3 decades.
Okay.
And looking ahead, construction starts for new nuclear power plants also grew by 50%.
Wow.
And all these new projects are based on Chinese and Russian designs.
Interesting. So it seems like while renewables are expanding rapidly, nuclear power is also making a comeback.
Yeah, it's definitely playing a bigger role. Okay, so we've talked about the overall trends in energy demand and supply, but let's zoom in on some of the key technologies that are driving this energy transition.
Okay.
Starting with electric vehicles.
Right.
It seems like everyone's talking about EVs these days.
Yeah, they're definitely getting a lot of attention, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Global EV sales continued to grow strongly in 2024.
Okay.
They rose by over 25% to more than 17 million units sold globally.
So that means EVs now make up a significant portion of all new car sales.
Yeah, they account for 20% of all new car sales worldwide.
20%. So 1 in every 5 new cars sold is electric.
Exactly. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is. So who's leading the charge in EV adoption?
Well, China is still the front runner.
Okay.
They accounted for almost 40% of the global growth in EV sales.
Wow.
And a lot of that growth came from plug-in hybrid electric vehicles.
Okay.
The U.S. also saw an increase in EV sales thanks to new models and tax credits.
Yep.
But Europe actually saw a slight dip in sales overall. Yeah, mainly because Germany removed their purchase subsidies.
Interesting.
But the UK saw a big surge in sales after they implemented their zero-emission vehicle mandate.
Okay.
And we also saw strong growth in EV adoption in emerging markets outside of China.
So it seems like EV adoption is happening all over the world.
Yeah, it's a global trend.
Okay, well, another technology that's often mentioned alongside EVs in the context of decarbonization is heat pumps.
Right. Heat pumps are becoming increasingly important.
Yeah, so how did heat pump sales do in 2024?
Well, globally, heat pump sales actually dipped a bit in 2024.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about 1% overall.
Okay.
The U.S. and Japan saw a strong recovery in sales in the second half of the year,
Oh.
but it wasn't enough to offset a decline in Europe and stagnation in China.
Okay.
In the U.S., heat pumps outsold gas furnaces by a significant margin.
Wow.
Yeah, but in Europe, there was a record decline in heat pump sales,
Okay.
likely due to a combination of high electricity prices,
Yeah, that makes sense.
policy uncertainty, and a slowdown in construction. China is still the biggest market for heat pumps overall, even though sales growth was flat there.
Interesting. So it seems like the story for heat pumps is a bit more mixed than for EVs.
Yeah, it really depends on the region.
Right. Okay. Well, let's circle back to solar, PV, and wind since they're playing such a big role in electricity generation.
Yeah, as we discussed earlier, there was a record 700 gigawatts of new renewable power capacity added in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
That's a 25% increase compared to the previous year.
Yeah, okay.
Solar PV was the dominant technology with 550 gigawatts of new capacity.
Wow.
Which is almost a 30% increase.
Okay.
Wind power additions were stable at around 120 gigawatts.
Okay.
China was the main driver behind these additions.
Yeah.
They actually surpassed their 2030 target for solar and wind capacity 6 years early.
Wow, that's impressive.
It is. The EU also saw high levels of new installations, but the rate of growth has stabilized.
Okay.
And the US, India, and Brazil all had record years for solar PV expansion.
So it seems like there's a lot of momentum behind solar and wind globally. Okay, so we've talked about energy demand, we've talked about supply, we've talked about all these different technologies. But now for the big question, What impact did all of this have on CO2 emissions?
Yeah, that's the key question, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, energy-related CO2 emissions did reach a new record high in 2024.
Oh,
They increased by 0.8%.
okay.
But the good news is that this growth rate is slower than the 1.2% increase we saw in 2023.
Okay, that's at least something.
It is, and importantly, emissions growth decoupled from global GDP growth.
What does that mean, decoupled?
It means that the global economy grew at a faster rate than its carbon emissions,
Oh, okay.
which is a positive sign.
Yeah, that is good news.
It shows that we're starting to break the link between economic growth and emissions.
That's encouraging. So what were the main sources of this emissions increase?
Well, emissions from natural gas were the biggest contributor, followed by coal. Oil emissions only increased slightly despite higher consumption. And we also saw a difference in emissions trends between developed and developing countries.
Okay.
Emissions increased in emerging economies and from international transport.
Okay.
But they actually fell in advanced economies led by the EU, Japan, and the US.
Interesting. So it seems like developed countries are making some progress in reducing their emissions.
Yeah, they are, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Right. Of course, what about China and India? How did their emissions do?
China's emissions grew slowly at 0.4%.
Okay.
But India had the fastest emissions growth among major economies at 5.3%.
Okay, so different stories in different parts of the world, as always.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you mentioned that emissions growth decoupled from GDP growth, but overall emissions are still rising. So what role did external factors like weather play in these figures?
Weather actually played a significant role.
Really?
Yeah, those record high temperatures we talked about earlier, they're estimated to have contributed to about half of the overall increase in emissions.
Wow, that's a big impact.
It is. We saw this especially in China and India, where the extreme heat led to more demand for electricity, for cooling, which meant they had to rely more on fossil fuels, especially coal.
So basically the emissions increase could have been even higher if the weather hadn't been so extreme.
That's right.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot about clean energy technologies and their rapid growth. So what impact did they have on emissions in 2024?
They had a huge impact.
Okay.
Our analysis shows that the deployment of clean energy technologies like solar PV, wind power, nuclear energy, electric vehicles, and heat pumps avoided a massive 2.6 billion tons of CO2 emissions annually.
2.6 billion tons.
Yeah, that's about 7% of total global emissions.
Wow. So without these technologies, emissions would be much higher.
Exactly. If it weren't for clean energy, the increase in emissions since 2019 would have been 3 times larger.
Wow. That's really puts it into perspective.
Yeah, it shows how important these technologies are in the fight against climate change.
Okay, so clean energy is clearly making a big difference.
Yeah.
But the report also mentions a slowdown in the rate of improvement in energy intensity.
Right.
What does that mean exactly?
So energy intensity is a measure of how much energy we use for each unit of economic output.
Okay.
And it improved at a slower pace in 2024 than the historical average.
Okay, so we're becoming less efficient.
In a way, yes.
Why is that?
There are a few reasons for this slowdown.
Okay.
One is the type of growth we're seeing in major developing economies,
Okay.
which tends to be more energy intensive.
Okay.
Another reason is the increased energy demand due to the extreme temperatures.
Right.
And there were also some challenges with hydropower output in certain regions.
Okay, so a combination of factors is contributing to this slowdown in energy efficiency improvements.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
What are the key takeaways you would like our listeners to remember?
I think the main points are that global energy demand is still rising.
Okay.
And this growth is mainly driven by emerging economies and the increasing demand for electricity.
Right.
Renewables and nuclear power are becoming more and more important in meeting this demand. And they're clearly having a positive impact on emissions.
Mm-hmm.
But fossil fuels are still a big part of the mix.
No,
And while emissions growth is slowing, we haven't reached a peak yet.
Okay.
Clean energy technologies are making a real difference.
Yeah.
But we need to speed up improvements in energy efficiency.
So it's a complex picture with both progress and challenges.
Absolutely.
Okay, so considering all these trends, the increasing energy needs, the shift towards cleaner sources, the ongoing role of fossil fuels, and the continuing rise in emissions, where do you think we're headed? What's your perspective?
Well, I think that leads to a really interesting question for our listeners.
Okay.
Given all these trends, what do you think will be the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity in the global energy transition in the years to come?
Yeah, that's a great question for our listeners to ponder.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the IEA's Global Energy Review 2025.
My pleasure.
We hope you found it informative and insightful, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the forces shaping our world.
See you then.
Bye.